The moment his fingers closed around her hair, the whole room went electric. I felt it before I understood it. That sudden hush that isn't silence at all, but 60 people leaning forward at once, waiting to see what would happen. We were in the middle of a lesson on planetary formation, Professor IronResolve's voice still hanging in the air mid-sentence, when Draven Core reached across the aisle and grabbed a fistful of Grace Whitfield's hair like he was testing a rope to see if it would snap. He gave it a hard tug. Her head jerked sideways, and the class laughed. I want to tell you I didn't laugh. I want to tell you I sat there with my arms folded, disgusted, above it all. But I laughed too, a short, nervous bark that left my mouth before my brain caught up with it, because Draven Core was loud and popular and confident in the way that makes everyone around him copy whatever he does, and because Grace was new and quiet, and nobody laughs at the new girl unless somebody else laughs first. She had been at the academy 8 days. 8 days of sitting alone at the back, answering questions in short, careful sentences, never volunteering anything about where she came from. There were rumors, the way there always are about the human students, that they were slow, that they had been led into the Concord out of pity rather than merit, that their bodies were soft in a way that made them easy to push around, easy to laugh at, easy to forget. Grace didn't cry out. She didn't even flinch the way you'd expect from someone whose hair has just been yanked hard enough to snap her head sideways. There was only a strange half-second of total stillness, her shoulders locking in place, and I remember thinking, even then, that it looked less like fear and more like a decision being made. Then she turned around. I have tried since that day to describe the look on her face, and I still can't get it exactly right. It wasn't anger. It wasn't the wounded, wet-eyed look the whole room seemed to be hoping for, the kind of look that would let everyone go back to laughing with a clean conscience. It was calm, steady, almost curious, like she was doing a small piece of math in her head and simply needed one more number to finish it. She looked at Draven's hand, still tangled in her hair the way you'd look at a chess piece somebody had placed badly. Then she reached up, slow and almost polite, and rested her fingers over his knuckles. "You should let go now," she said. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't shake. The translator strip on the wall caught every word and repeated it in 6 languages at once, and somehow the flatness of her tone made it land harder than shouting ever could have. Draven grinned around at the room, playing to his audience, because he wasn't about to lose face to a girl half his size in front of 60 classmates. He held on. So she showed him the arithmetic instead. I still can't tell you exactly what her hands did. It wasn't fast in the dramatic way you'd expect, no flourish, no wasted motion. It was simply efficient. Her wrist turned maybe 15 degrees. His grip came apart as if it had never really been a fist, and in the space of one breath he was folded forward over the aisle at an angle a body isn't built for, one arm pinned flat and harmless against his own back. The sound he made wasn't pain exactly. It was surprise. The small, startled noise of someone large realizing, for the first time in his life, that his own strength had just stopped answering to him. Nobody laughed. I don't think anybody in that room breathed. Professor Sell had half risen from her desk with a word frozen in her mouth. Draven's tail, usually held high and confident, had gone rigid and flat against the floor, and though I didn't know it yet, I would later learn that this particular stillness in a drozzle is what fear looks like when a body has never had to feel it before. Grace held him there for exactly as long as it took to make her point, not 1 second longer. Then she let go, sat back down, and picked her stylus up again, as calmly as if she were returning to a sentence she'd been interrupted in the middle of writing. "Sorry," she said, to the room, not to him. "He's fine, nothing's torn." A pause, and then quieter, almost to herself, but the translator caught that too. "We're not soft, we just don't usually bother." Draven slid back into his seat holding his shoulder, and he didn't say one more word for the rest of the class. Nobody looked at him, and from that moment on, nobody ever reached for anything that belonged to Grace Whitfield again. Not her hair, not her chair, not the space around her. That should have been the end of it. In most stories it would have been. But the academy wasn't finished testing her yet, and neither, it turned out, was I. 3 days later we were assigned to the same combat simulation module, a requirement for every second-year student regardless of species, meant to prepare us for situations no textbook could cover. The instructor that day was a broad, silver-skinned man named Tobin Vance, who ran the sessions less like a teacher and more like someone auditioning recruits for a war he expected any day. He paired students at random, and when my name came up beside Grace's, I felt a flicker of something between relief and nerves. Relief, because after what I'd seen, I trusted her more than I trusted myself. Nerves, because I still hadn't found the courage to apologize for laughing. The simulation put us in a mock corridor meant to resemble a disabled transport ship, dim red emergency lighting overhead, The hum of a failing life support system piped in through hidden speakers to keep our pulses up. Somewhere in the maze of corridors, 3 simulated hostiles were waiting, holographic constructs designed to test reaction time and teamwork rather than cause harm, though they felt real enough to make my hands sweat. Grace moved through that corridor like she had walked it 100 times before. She didn't rush. She checked corners before crossing them, kept her steps light, kept me close enough that neither of us was ever fully exposed. When the first hologram flickered into existence at the end of the hall, some winged simulated creature meant to represent an unknown threat, I froze. She didn't. She simply stepped in front of me, angled her body so the sensor array on the construct would register her first, and guided it into a dead-end corridor where it looped harmlessly until the system marked it neutralized. Afterward, in the debrief room, Instructor Vance asked her where she'd learned to move like that. She shrugged, the same small, almost embarrassed shrug I would come to recognize as her only tell. "Combat Sambo," she said. "Basic stuff. Every kid on my home colony learns it by the time they're 12. 12, Vance repeated, and something in his face shifted, though he didn't ask anything further. I asked her myself, later that evening, when we were sitting in the mostly empty dining hall and I finally worked up the nerve to bring it up. "Why 12? I asked. "Why does every kid where you're from need to know how to do that?" She was quiet for a moment, turning her cup slowly on the table. "Because sometimes somebody grabs you," she said, "and doesn't let go, and you don't always get to wait for somebody else to help." I didn't have an answer for that. I still don't think I do. Word about the classroom incident spread through the academy faster than anything I had ever seen. By the end of the week, half the station seemed to know the story, though it had grown in the telling the way stories always do, until some versions claimed Grace had thrown Draven clear across the room, which wasn't true, and others claimed she'd broken something, which also wasn't true. The truth, plain and undramatic as it was, seemed to matter less than the shape of the story people wanted to tell. Draven himself avoided her entirely after that, which surprised no one. What surprised everyone, myself included, was who came looking for her next. Her name was Amara Voss, a tall, sharp-eyed girl from the diplomatic track, daughter of someone important enough that teachers said her name a little more carefully than everyone else's. Amara had a reputation of her own, not for cruelty exactly, but for testing people, poking at them the way you might poke a strange object to see how it reacts. She found Grace in the training yard one afternoon, where a handful of students were practicing basic defensive movement under the open dome that let in the pale light of the station's artificial day cycle. "I want to see if the stories are true," Amara said, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Not the fighting part, the other part, that you don't get scared." Grace didn't answer right away. She was in the middle of stretching, one hand braced against the low railing, and she finished the motion before she even looked up. "Everybody gets scared," she said finally. "I just don't let it decide what happens next." "That's not an answer," Amara said, stepping closer, close enough that a few students around us went quiet and started watching without pretending not to. Grace straightened up fully then, and something in the way she held herself changed, not aggressive, not defensive, just present, fully and completely present in a way that made the space around her feel smaller. "Fine," she said. "Ask me something real then." Amara hesitated, like she hadn't expected to actually get the offer. Then she asked the question everyone had clearly been wondering since the story first spread. "What would you have done," she asked, "if he hadn't let go, if you'd had to make him?" The training yard went very quiet. "I wouldn't have hurt him," Grace said simply. "That was never the point. There are 100 ways to make somebody stop without breaking anything, and every one of them starts with staying calm enough to find it. Panic is the only thing in that moment that actually makes people dangerous, not size, not strength. Panic." Amara studied her for a long moment, and I watched something shift behind her eyes, some private recalculation taking place. Then, unexpectedly, she smiled. Not a mocking smile, but something closer to respect. "My father always told me humans were dangerous because they were desperate," she said. "I think he had it backward. You're dangerous because you're not." She turned and walked away after that, and whatever test she had been running seemed to end there, though I noticed she never spoke a cruel word about Grace again. And more than that, I noticed she started watching her the way you watch someone you're quietly deciding to learn from. I thought that would be the last of it, the last test, the last proving ground, but the station itself had other plans. 2 weeks later, during a routine maintenance cycle, one of the older sections near the eastern docking ring lost pressure in a containment failure that the safety briefings had always described as impossible, the kind of thing drilled into us in theory but never expected in practice. The alarm cut through every classroom at once, A rising, three-toned pulse that every student on the station had been trained to recognize instantly. Professor Sell's voice cracked slightly as she called for calm, and for one long, terrible moment nobody moved, because knowing the drill and living the drill are two very different things. Grace moved first. She was already up and directing the students nearest the door toward the marked evacuation corridor before most of us had even fully processed what was happening, her voice steady in a way that cut cleanly through the rising noise of 60 frightened students. "Not this way," she said, catching two younger students who had started toward the main corridor out of habit rather than thought. "That leads past the docking ring. We go around." I don't know how she knew the layout of that section so quickly, but I would learn later that she had spent her first few free hours at the academy, walking every corridor on the station, memorizing exits the way some people memorize faces, because on her home colony, she told me afterward, you learned early that knowing your way out of a room could matter more than anything you learned inside it. We moved through the halls in a tight, organized line, Grace at the back rather than the front, making sure nobody fell behind, checking each side corridor before we passed it the same calm, careful way she'd moved through that training simulation days before. When one of the younger students, a small quiet boy named Elian, stumbled and dropped his emergency breather in the rush, it was Grace who doubled back without hesitation, retrieved it, and got it back into his shaking hands before he'd even finished registering that he'd lost it. We reached the safe zone with air to spare, the containment breach sealed off long before it ever reached us, thanks in no small part to the fact that our section evacuated cleanly and without the chaos that swept through two other classrooms that day. When the station administrators reviewed the incident logs afterward, they singled out our group specifically, remarking on how quickly and calmly we had moved compared to every other class on that level. Professor Sell found Grace afterward, in the quiet aftermath while the rest of us sat wrapped in emergency blankets waiting for the all clear. I watched them speak from a distance, too far to hear the words, but close enough to see the professor's expression, something between gratitude and a kind of careful, dawning respect. Later, once things had settled and the station had returned to its normal rhythm, Professor Sell brought it up in class, in front of everyone, which I think surprised Grace more than anything else that had happened so far. "I have taught at this academy for 11 years, the professor said, and I have never seen a group of second-year students handle an emergency with that level of composure. I would like to know why." The room turned to look at Grace, the way it always seemed to now, though this time the attention didn't carry the same edge it once had. She looked uncomfortable, the way she always did when the room's focus landed on her, but she answered anyway. "Where I'm from," she said, "we don't wait for someone else to stay calm first. We're just taught to be the calm, whether we feel it or not. Because usually, if you can be steady, everyone around you finds a way to be steady too." Nobody laughed at that. Nobody had laughed at anything Grace said in weeks, not since the day her hair had been pulled and she had turned around and shown the whole room something none of us had expected to see. I think about that day often, the shape of it, how small it seemed at the time and how much it ended up changing. 11 species sat in that classroom, and only one of them, it turned out, had grown up needing an answer to the question of what to do when somebody grabs you and doesn't let go. We had spent so long hearing that humans were the soft ones, the late arrivals, the species led into the wider community more out of courtesy than respect, that nobody had thought to ask why every human student on that station moved through the world a little more carefully than the rest of us, why they checked exits, why they stayed calm when alarms went off, why none of them ever seemed surprised by trouble even when it came without warning. Grace never talked about her home colony much, not in any real detail, and I never pushed her to. Some things, I came to understand, aren't stories people tell because they enjoy telling them. They're simply the shape a person becomes because of what they lived through before anyone else was watching. What I do know is this: the laughter stopped that day, and it never really came back, not in the way it had before. In its place came something quieter and, I think, far more valuable. We started listening. Really listening. The way you listen to someone who has already survived the thing you're only now beginning to imagine. Dravencore never apologized in words, not that I ever heard, but I noticed, months later, during another emergency drill, that he was the one checking on the youngest students, guiding them calmly toward the exits the way he had once seen someone else do. Maybe that was his apology. Maybe it was simply proof that calm, once shown clearly enough, has a way of spreading whether anyone intends it to or not. As for Grace, she stayed quiet, stayed careful, kept sitting near the back of the room out of habit rather than isolation now, because these days, whenever she looked up, there was always somebody nearby willing to meet her eyes and nod, quietly, the way you nod at someone you have decided, without needing to say it aloud, that you trust. The classroom laughed the day he pulled her hair. It never laughed at her again. And somewhere along the way, without any of us quite noticing when it happened, we stopped being a room full of strangers from 11 different worlds, and became something closer to what she had been the whole time, without ever once needing to prove it twice.